If you're a Canadian investor and you're looking for a place to put your money to collect great dividends that has a huge potential for growth, one of the best areas has been the oil market. Canada's oil sands stocks are built for the long term, and investors who are willing to hold for a couple of years are likely to make a huge amount of money. One of the things that's been accelerating this asymmetric return potential have been Canada's pipelines, specifically the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline and LNG Canada with the Coastal GasLink pipeline. Both of these are transforming the oil and gas industry. However, there's always the story of what's next. What's getting built in the next 5, 10, 15 years that'll continue the growth and allow for continued expansion, not only of the oil sands companies, but of the industry in general, and of course of shareholder returns. Now, this is a story we've covered pretty closely here on the channel, but there have been some fairly massive developments in the last little while that I do want to cover. I've given them a couple of days to simmer. I didn't want to jump right on the story right when it came out, but I think I've had enough time to really digest what's going on here and tell you exactly what you as an investor need to know to understand what's going on in this industry. Welcome to Golden Arch Investing. My name is Liam. On this channel, we talk about investing in Canada, and if that interests you at all, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. We've got on the screen right here beside me a cooperation agreement on pipelines, critical minerals, and responsible energy development between Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Now, this deal already more or less existed between Alberta and Ontario, and it's been adapted a little bit to include Saskatchewan and to sort of really give us a good idea of what exactly it is that these provinces want to get done. Now, I think it's an important thing to say right here that none of these projects are expected to be entirely government built. Instead, the provinces are more or less going to each other saying, hey, we could do this cool thing, and then sort of side-eyeing the commercial investors who might actually build the thing saying, come on, come build this. Nothing is going to get built in the short term. However, when we do see projects that start to get really, real backing, start to get these big money on the table, we get these big infrastructure partners, we get the providers, we get all the pieces together. If the government's on side, that's huge. Now, I do want to point out that a lot of people have said that more or less Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, they can't do anything. They're just provinces. You need the federal government on board. They're not going to get anything done. We've seen a lot of the negative sort of statements coming out of people who are just like refuse to believe that anything can be built in Canada. I've been fairly positive, but it is important to point out, obviously, we're missing a really important province in the middle here. I did see some storylines that tried to frame that as Manitoba is going to block this potential pipeline. Manitoba will not allow pipelines through here. I don't know that that's really what we've heard from the provinces. I listened to a couple of interesting interviews, and it's more or less that Manitoba has a different idea about how to consult Indigenous groups to get these things done than Alberta, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. I'm sure you can picture right now in your head exactly why that is, that maybe Manitoba would take a different approach than those provinces. At the end of the day, I think they're going to be on the team. They've been on the team as far as anything going to the north coast of Manitoba, up on Hudson's Bay. Why would they not be on the team? Anything going through Manitoba towards either southern Ontario or towards James Bay. So there's a couple of things they got in this deal that I think are interesting. Specifically, they mentioned common goals as a recognized leader in sustainable and secure energy production, supply, and transportation as their first item. Pipelines is at the top of this list. They talk about reducing global energy dependence on foreign actors. Again, pipelines. They talk about supporting industry's effort to attract investment, build pipelines, rail, and other transportation infrastructure, and enhance export and value-added opportunities for Canadian oil and gas, critical minerals, and related energy industries. So all really interesting things. And so the purpose of this is to get, Canadian minerals mined and processed in Canada and Western Canadian oil and natural gas via pipelines to refineries, seaports, and storage facilities, including but not limited to sites in James Bay and southern Ontario. Now, we have heard a couple times now about the idea of exporting Canadian oil from Hudson's Bay. There are pros and there are cons. The pro is that you can get this oil out towards the Atlantic for a good chunk of the year. The con is that it is not all of the time without serious investments in specific infrastructure like icebreakers and sort of, consistent work keeping the Northwest Passage more or less open. So keeping the export from Hudson's Bay. Now, obviously, the idea that the oceans are warming up and that their ice is sort of less permissive or sort of, I guess pervasive would be a better word. The ice isn't going to block you quite as much. That's a big idea that's been going on. Is that going to be enough that this gets sort of, this doesn't need to exist, or you don't need any of this specialized equipment in 10 years? Who knows? I have no idea what the weather's going to do. But at the very least, it seems feasible. Russia does the same thing on their north coast. Norway is a massive exporter of oil and gas. There's no reason that Canada couldn't invest in this. It's just going to take a lot of money. There's also the question of the Canadian Shield. If you've never lived on the Canadian Shield, then you probably don't understand just how giant a problem this is. Somebody who spent my entire childhood living right on the edge and spent a lot of time up in the Canadian Shield camping and adventuring, let me tell you, it is some of the most beautiful but difficult to build on infrastructure anywhere on Earth. So it is really quite a challenge to get anything up there. If you look at a map of Canada, you'll notice there's a big space where there's nothing there. That's because of the Canadian Shield. So building infrastructure through it to get to, be it the ports in Manitoba or James Bay is a challenge, is a real challenge. And obviously it's going to take massive equipment and infrastructure. Now, we did build pipelines through the Rocky Mountains, which I would argue are even more difficult. So obviously it's not impossible for us here in Canada. It's just going to take a lot of money. And when it comes to, big infrastructure spend, there's not a lot of companies willing to drop that amount of money without serious guarantees from the government that these things will get built and that there will be no serious delays racking up bills like they did on the West Coast. The second part of this question is the idea of bringing oil to Southern Ontario. I read through at least 100 comments talking about that specific line in here. And I think the argument is split between two groups. One group thinks that this is a great idea and that we will use Canadian oil to reduce our dependence on foreign actors. Now, when we talk about foreign actors, we're talking about mainly two groups. So one, the Americans. Obviously, there's been a huge movement in Canada to sort of distance ourselves culturally and economically from the Americans. Second is the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, who ship out a lot of the world's heavy oil and who have in the past shipped heavy oil to Canada. Now, in the West, where I live now, let me tell you, people are real angry about Canada importing heavy oil, the exact same kind of oil we produce here, at a premium from international actors. Remember, Canadian oil trades at a $7, $8 discount right the second to Saudi Arabian oil. So we're paying extra money to bring that oil to Canada. Reason being, we could not transport it from the west to the east in a sufficient quantity to fill the supply. Now, there is already an existing pipeline going to Southern Ontario, and it does include Enbridge Line 5 going through Michigan, and there's all sorts of question marks about that. One of the things that's gone on is that Enbridge is looking to expand, sort of not like TMX double expansion, but, reinforce this pipeline, make it sustainable for longer term, go through and make sure that there's any reliability issues. This is a massive, massive infrastructure piece. It has a million things that could go wrong. Enbridge wants to make sure that doesn't happen. So they spend a lot of money on upgrading it. However, they've run into trouble crossing through Michigan into Ontario. All sorts of problems going under the lakes there. And so there have been some people saying, hey, we need to, make an all in Canada option, gives us more opportunity to ship more oil to the east, allows for more growth there, allows for us to completely displace any international oil. That's the one camp. The other camp says, there is no way we're going to build another pipeline through this part, again, Canadian Shield on the north side of the Great Lakes without it costing tens of billions of dollars. And at that point, the oil would not be competitive with shipping international supply because Canadian oil is likely to see less of the discounting. And so it'd just be such a challenge. There's also a group of people who say that it's likely that we might see this oil in pipelines shipped to Thunder Bay, which is on the west coast of the Great Lakes, and then brought through the Great Lakes on tankers, basically, freshwater oil tankers over towards Southern Ontario. I've also seen commenters say that that's impossible because of treaties with the United States. The Americans would be really mad about it. We also risk then, obviously, oil spills in the Great Lakes, which, again, would be hugely damaging, not only to the economy, but obviously to just Canada in general, right? The Great Lakes are such a supply of amazing fresh water. Putting oil tankers on them runs a risk. And I mean, you can ask, all sorts of folks about the dangers of sailing the Great Lakes. They are not this, calm, flat, easy body of water where there's no risk of any sort of damage. So there are question marks to both of these projects, and they basically come down to, it's expensive. Are you willing to pony up the money? Are there going to be government guarantees to make this happen? This memorandum of understanding is supposed to create a board that will hopefully create the circumstances where these projects can get built. But I don't know exactly how much chance there is that we see this actually happen in the shorter term. They've outlined some areas of cooperation. There's a couple that I think are really interesting. One, a little bit sort of disconnected from the current conversation we're having is development of rail infrastructure to support the subsequent phases of Ring of Fire. So talking about increasing Canada's mining, the mining supply chain, all these things, which is really interesting. Pardon me. Next is joint development of commercial operations for building new oil and gas pipelines, including extensions and enhancements to existing pipeline infrastructure between Alberta and refineries, seaports, storage facilities, and Ontario. So in addition, Ontario will support cross-country pipelines that connect Alberta and Saskatchewan oil to new domestic and export markets beyond Ontario. So they're basically saying, in return for trying to get this done, we're going to also support your other projects. We're going to be a voice in your favor. Obviously, Ontario has quite a lot of sway when it comes to Canadian sort of interprovincial politics. They're a really big province. So maybe that's kind of Ontario leaning on BC saying, hey, maybe do that not James Bay, Prince Rupert pipeline, that North Coast BC pipeline, and that Ontario will support consideration of strategic long-term storage of critical fuels in Canada, such as a Canadian Strategic Petroleum Reserve in Ontario with Canadian oil. Basically, all of this is supposed to help support energy independence. Ontario is the hub of Canadian manufacturing. Back in the day when Canada was a much younger country and the West was basically a resource colony, the resources of the West were shipped to Ontario to build the manufacturing industry. This is not really all that different. It's just a different resource for different industries. They also plan on working collaboratively to launch a preliminary joint feasibility study this year to move more sector investments in rail pipelines and ports. So we should expect to see that in the not so distant future. Is there going to be a feasibility study done? And if it's dropped quietly, they're basically saying, it's too expensive. There's also all sorts of cool things going on with nuclear reactors, which we talked about, and both provinces leaning on the federal government to get rid of some of the laws that basically every conservative premier in the country has said, hey, these limit expansion. They limit the oil and gas industry. We're talking Impact Assessment Act. We're talking the North Coast oil tanker ban. All these kinds of things. The emissions cap, the emissions mandate for vehicle. There's just a laundry list of things that they're saying this is stymieing economic growth at a time that we cannot afford it. And the conservative premiers are basically going across the board and saying, we are agreed and we represent a huge chunk of the country and the economies of the country. So please, let's do something about these. Obviously, legislation isn't being passed right now. It's the middle of August, or it's the middle of summer, I guess. It's this not quite August yet, but we're at a point where we're going to see very little going on as far as laws, but we will see a lot going on as far as sort of announcements, studies, memorandums of understanding. It's like prime promise season right now because nobody's going to build anything, but there's lots of people that are planning on doing things. So why do I think this is so important for us as investors? I got two things I want to say here sort of before we wrap. One, we're going to see a feasibility study this year, and that's going to massively shift the market one way or the other. If it said, hey, this can get built, if we can reasonably, feasibly, in an economically beneficial way that will benefit the company building it, that will benefit the producers who we, of course, as investors own, and will benefit, either the province of Ontario, the industries of Ontario, the manufacturing, whatever it is that needs oil in Ontario, and we can get a James Bay port built, we can get, oil, maybe natural gas as well, exported from there, right? We'll see a study that says exactly what we should expect from this. And I would set my expectations fairly low right this second. I'm normally a huge perma bull on this industry. Again, I have lived my life on the edge of the Canadian Shield. I know just how remote it is in these areas we're talking about. I have driven along the North Shore of the Great Lakes. It would be expensive. So there are definitely question marks. We'll see how far this Canadiana goes. I would love to see a project like this actually get built, but I just know that people are going to take the easier options first. And as an investor, that does make sense because it guarantees better return for shareholders. Second thing that I want you to look out for. Do we see the continued building of alliances among different premiers start to get momentum done for some of these projects? Do we see promises being made? We're supposed to have this major projects group within the federal government ready by the end of the summer. Do we see announcements, approvals, right? Projects actually come out? Do we see proponents step up, right? Watch for that news because that news will move markets. Again, we are at a point where Canadian oil and gas just has huge potential to grow. Basically, there's all these things that are just getting out of the way at the right moment, and the US is about to lose their main source of additional oil. So there's so many things going right for the industry. This could be one of them, but this is a longer shot than a lot of other things that have been proposed. Anyways, that's what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you like these projects? Do you think they're crazy? Do you like seeing these provinces work together? And how do you think this is going to impact the industry? As always, if you watch this far in the video, please like the video. If you like what we do here on the channel, please do subscribe. And I hope I see you in our next video.